The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle.
Barbara's taking this very seriously. I think she wants to try and beat Michelle Obama's score, doesn't she?
I'm thinking about the words and the associations and the blue carbuncle. I don't know. I don't feel this is like a modern sort of title. I'm going to say elementary, my dear Watson.
You're listening to the Occupational Philosophers with Simon Banks and John Rice.
And welcome to the Occupational Philosophers, a not-so-serious business podcast designed to spark your creativity, curiosity, and imagination. Simon, welcome.
John, nice to be welcomed and good to see you. Good introduction.
Shall we start as ever with what's caught our eye this week? What's caught your curious eye this week, Simon?
John, coffee has caught my eye because I've spent the last 2 days in a workshop around coffee. And what you realize is, even though you like coffee, I like coffee, you think you know it. Once you dive down, oh my goodness, the world of coffee, I realize I'm like just operating at a 1 out of 10 where I really could be at a 10 out of 10. And I said to my wife, I said, look, the good thing is we love our coffee, but we've just got so much more of an adventure to go on. So yeah, the grind and the bean and, John, my eyes and heart have been opened. And here's the one thing I worked out, because, I like to buy things which are sustainably sourced and leave a good footprint, organic, etc. Now, no baristas will go anywhere near the fair trade coffee, because fair trade coffee only concentrates on the fairness of the trade, not on the quality of the coffee. So how's that? Those two worlds don't combine. Not because they don't want to, but because the beans are average. So it's like a plumber saying, well, I'm going to make sure everything we're using in your toilet is ethically sourced when I fix it, but there's a fair chance it won't work. Now, you would then go, well, based on that, I'll have to go with the bits that'll work. So even though ethically sourced, my ideal thing, I want to be able to, I want to get the best out of my toilet. So that was my, I don't know if it's the best definition, but that's, anyway, my insight this week.
I'm just thinking you're very demanding, Simon. You want a working toilet and really good coffee.
I know,
I'd hate to be behind you in the coffee queue. What grind is it? Where do the beans come from? Where does it sit on this spectrum chart I've got here? It tells me about the different flavors. Just get on with it.
And also, what's happening in the toilet at the back? Is that ethical? So, so there you go, John. Yeah. What's caught your curious eye this week?
What's caught my curious eye is I was watching various wildlife programs. David Attenborough's back on telly, so he usually comes up with a lovely documentary that talks about the different flora and fauna across the world. And so it had us think about the collective nouns of things and animals and people, because he was talking about schools of dolphins and things like this. And I thought, I wonder what the collective nouns are for these different things. So, for example, we would all know a board of directors. That is a collective noun. We would have bananas. Do you know what the collective term is for bananas?
A hand.
Any idea? It's not. Well, it's a comb, which I kind of get. I can kind of get that comb and bananas going. And then, but my favorite is always animals. I mean, animals always give the best collective noun. So you have, for example, a prickle of porcupines. And then you got, this is a good one as well, a mob of wombats. Which gives them a sense of danger, I think, doesn't it? Oh my gosh, here comes a mob. Because the other mob you get is a mob of rioters. So if you had rioting wombats, I mean, you really would be quids in with that one. A mob of wombats. And then the very grand exaltation of larks. There you go. Exaltation of larks. So I thought that was really good. So that's what caught my eye. I then started extending that and thinking of what the collective noun for podcasters would be. And I decided on a shambles of podcasters.
Hashtag shambles. Copyright John Rice. Yeah.
But today, Simon, is a guest episode. And rather excitingly, we have two guests. So today, the collective noun is a delight of guests.
Anything but a shambles. So, John.
Yeah.
As always, how exciting. We have two curious cats, so it's a bit of a first.
Two
for
curious
us.
cats. Who are
So-
they, Simon? Give us an introduction.
Our first delight of guest is an innovator for public good and has worked as a public servant, a strategic human-centered design consultant, bartender, pizza deliverer, emu farmhand, and the leader of an academic research centre. He is now a course director of the Master of Creative Intelligence and Strategic Innovation at the University of Technology, Sydney TD School. The TD stands for Transdisciplinary, and is completing a doctorate in transdisciplinary innovation and philosophy. Our second delight of a guest specialises in identifying creative opportunities that respond to complex challenges and putting them into action. She's an experienced speaker, mentor, educator, project innovator, and artist who directs her energies to building our collective capacities to improve how we live. But there's more, John, but there's more. She's worked with some of Australia's leading practitioners and award-winning productions, including Jungle Boys, Australia's largest TV commercials production company, Mythbusters in San Francisco, and I'm sure you know that show, and alongside key filmmaking professionals whose credits include The Matrix, Moulin Rouge, and The Great Gatsby. Let's welcome our delight of guests, Rodger Watson and Dr. Barbara Doran. Yay! Now, just before I kick it off, is it Doran or Doran? How do you like it?
Oh, I say Doran.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
good. So, building on that, Dr. Barbara Doran, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, it's school holidays over here, and my sister came up from South Australia, so actually Melbourne, Victoria, and we've been, had long lockdowns. I haven't actually seen her for ages. She's got kids, and we had to entertain the kids, so we went down to the local oval. She lives in a rural area, and they'd been camping for the last few weeks, and we were watching the kids play basketball, but because it was holidays, there was a bunch of kids playing basketball. And what was really interesting was we were watching, this ball bouncing around, but there were kids from different groups, and they were all sharing the same hoop. And they had this kind of self-organizing way of kind of going, okay, your group has a go at the hoop, and then, somebody else has it. And she was just saying, so interesting how city works. And, you come from the country and you notice that there's all these people and there's a hive of activity and there's this real buzz, but there's all these things that happen. And it reminds me of kind of like ants' nests and termites and bees, and how the city is this kind of place that draws human activity, but at the same time, it has its tentacles out into the regional areas. So we kind of got on this really long rave about cities being like these kind of, ecosystems and the parallels between them, and then rural towns, and in a way how if the further away you are from somewhere and the kind of more remote you are, the harder it is because Australia's got these huge, vast distances between things, the harder it is to kind of cross-pollinate. And we don't have a really great public transport system. And then we got onto this rave about how, in Europe, you've got the very fast train system, and you can kind of live in more regional areas and still get to the cities really quickly. And there's this way of kind of sharing resources and ideas, and there's this kind of more live network breathing pulsing system between regional areas. Anyway, it kept going, but it was, it started with bouncing basketballs and the idea of sharing, and this kind of idea that the city is this buzzy place. It's something that I think about a lot. The benefits of the city and the way that we link up, and that kind of the whole ecosystems approach. So I could keep going, but that was
Wish you could. It's another episode.
Well,
yeah,
it is another episode. And is that for you, Barbara? That's a spark of an idea, or presents some sort of metaphor for ecosystems, as you might say, which you might find in different scenarios, such as an organization.
Yeah,
not so serious business, and how you might ferment or create that kind of environment. Presumably,
Yep.
How do we do this? How can we make this work for ideas to flow all over?
How are patterns of nature, patterns that we find in nature, replicated through our own behavior, through the organizations we create, through finance systems, traffic systems, whatever,
Rodger, what's caught your curious eye this week?
Well, this morning, actually, I had a coffee with a colleague who I haven't seen for about 5 years, a wonderful practitioner by the name of Judy Saba, who works for the police. And it was instigated because a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to Morning Breakfast, and there was a guest on the breakfast show talking about food tours around our multicultural suburbs in Sydney. And one of the guests was Judy Saba, and I thought, could that be the same Judy Saba that I worked with at New South Wales Police, who uses her background in psychology to crack cold murder cases, as an unsworn officer? And so I reached out to her on LinkedIn, and indeed it was. So she's had this side hustle as someone running food tours around wonderful multicultural communities that we have in Sydney, Lebanese walks around particular suburbs that have amazing restaurants and amazing providores and greengrocers. And for a lot of Sydney-siders, some of these suburbs have quite a stigma to them, and a lot of Sydney-siders perhaps wouldn't go there for fear of violence. But I think the work that Judy's been doing is really challenging that and turning it on its head and turning that diversity of culture into a strength of Sydney. So this morning we had a coffee and caught up for the first time in 5 years. And I had my 2 children there because, as Barbara said, it's school holidays, and we've agreed to go on a food tour in the next couple of weeks. So.
That was my next question. Are you on a food tour, and where is it to?
Yeah, so it's in a suburb called Greenacre in the southwest of Sydney, and there's a lot of Lebanese restaurants there and things that, I've visited that suburb, but I wouldn't know exactly where to go to find these things. So I think once I've been on the tour, it'll be somewhere where I'll take interstate visitors or family members who come to Sydney to visit. And the conversation with her about her work was fascinating as well. There's a real crossover with the book that we're going to be talking about.
And that's a lovely way, isn't it? I mean, food is such a nice way to get drawn into a culture, or if you're curious about it, because it's not just the food, it's the kind of the setup they have at those kind of restaurants. You'd see something of the way they live as well, don't you? Just the way they bring that restaurant to life as they serve the food to you. That gives you something as well. Yeah. Wonderful. I like that.
You can sort of tell, which are the really good restaurants by the number of locals who are there. And that really draws me in. And I think with borders opening up again, of course, we're going to see more overseas travel, but we're so lucky in Sydney to have such a multicultural community and all of this really authentic cuisine.
Just so we get a fix on where you are in the world today, because we have obviously a global listenership. Whereabouts are you? We haven't had a 2-guest episode before, but can you tell us where you are, Barbara? Where are you today?
I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is the Indigenous name for otherwise called suburb Dulwich Hill. And that's in the inner west of Sydney in Australia.
And I'm overlooking Camaragal land, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on. The knowledge is lost, sadly. We don't know who the traditional custodians were of this part of Sydney, Lambie Heights, but I can see Camaragal land. I can see Manly from where I'm sitting talking to you. And for anyone who's not been to Sydney, Manly is definitely a place you should go and see. It's a beachside suburb, and it's just beautiful and vibrant and international.
You're right on the march today for Sydney. We've got to go visit Manly, come to Greenacre. So clothing recommendations for the time we leave as well. So no, this is good. This is good. Now, how would you both describe what you do? So Rodger first, and following up on that, what are your intersections? Like what crosses over for you?
So I guess in my bio, I describe myself as an innovator for public good. So I studied psychology as my undergrad, and my first foray into the public service was working with victims of crime, victims of violent crime. I worked in a counselling team and worked in triage with people who'd been victims of assaults and domestic violence, sexual abuse as well. and worked with families of homicide victims. And really from that experience, I knew that I'd found my calling, not necessarily working on crime, although I have spent a significant amount of my career doing that, crime prevention, I should say, not working in crime, but working in crime prevention. And yeah, but what a challenging job as a young 20-something to have. And I'd sort of had my first experience with burnout after a couple of years of working in that context. I was homicide clerk for New South Wales, so if any family member was murdered, I'd be talking with the family members, arranging counselling, sometimes repatriating bodies overseas, working on the logistics of that, etc. So I had an opportunity to move to a different part of the department that I was working in, the Department of Justice, which was crime prevention. And I hadn't really a notion of crime prevention until I landed there. I landed there in a comms role and pretty soon realised that, yeah, this is definitely an area of practice that I think I can contribute to and that I think would help make the world a better place. So I did a Masters of Criminology to really learn the trade and was applying that as a crime prevention officer and leading a team of crime preventers. And the way we'd work is we'd go out to local communities like Greenacre, as we've mentioned before, like Manly, as we mentioned before, and Dulwich Hill. And we'd talk with the local government area about what crime issues they were facing, and then we'd work with them to find an evidence-based approach of dealing with that crime issue. And so, I'd done my Masters, pretty decent Masters. I learnt a lot. But as a practitioner, I was getting really frustrated with the rationality that crime prevention practice had. It treated quite complex societal issues as what we'd call simple problems that had an obvious solution to them. And I could feel that as a practitioner, and I could see in practice a lot of the people I was working with in community were coming from different disciplinary lenses and trying different things. And in our way of working, there wasn't really a way of doing that. So I started to get a bit jaded with how we were working, which was a problem because I was leading the team, and that's not a good recipe. But I had an opportunity to come over to the University of Technology, Sydney in 2010 on a 6-month secondment to have a look at the Designing Out Crime Research Centre. So it was using design as a way of looking at crime. And instantly I saw, wow, okay, this is a different way of working. This is about taking on complexity in a different way, acknowledging complexity, not trying to solve it, using design as a way of understanding an issue, reframing an issue, and creating new things, new ways of responding to the complexity. So I recognized that. So I started my PhD there, and the 6-month secondment turned into 8 years of leading the team, and a body of work that I'm immensely proud of, and a body of work that has made lives better and continues to. For those of you visiting Sydney, our most visible innovation is a rubbish bin, but that rubbish bin has taken on the complex issue of terrorist threats on our rail network. So the interventions sort of ranged from that physical object through to systems, policy, strategy, and where I sit now, having done a lot of study into how people think and how people take on complexity. My work now is much more at the strategy end of the spectrum, although I could probably whip you up a prototype for a rubbish bin if I had to.
Oh, good to hear. Good to hear. Good to hear. Give that man 4 toilet rolls and some tape, and he is away.
And really interesting, Rodger, as you're saying it there, the word that did come to mind, you said it was reframing, that a lot of these complex problems, and you talk to it in the book, which I know we're going to come to, this idea of making sure you're looking at a complex problem through different lenses, maybe, because then you might arrive or come to the right design or policy or whatever that would actually have some real impact. Yeah. So that's then something you have taken forward then into the creative pursuit that you have with the book and beyond.
That's right. And it's not necessarily as simple as it sounds, because these frames are often held in place by structures, by organisations, by practices that might be hundreds of years old, and the ways of working that are entrenched. So the creative reboot, I guess, is a response to that and a way of opening up the space bringing in a freedom of thought so that the more seismic paradigm shifts can happen. And there's a great local example in Glasgow in Scotland, where it used to be seen as the knife crime capital of the world, and police had sort of done all the usual evidence-based things and weren't really having an impact. And so they tried something different, and they hired a public health person called Karen McCuskell, who came into that situation and looked at knife crime as if it was an epidemic. And so that's a very different frame of reference to take on a challenge. And she had they had great results from that reframe. And that's I guess a simple example of how a problem is framed in a certain way that usually dictates the solution frame, or the frame that is responsible for the problem. But if you reframe the problem from crime to public health, it opens up an enormous opportunity of a new disciplinary space to apply to a problem that has probably not been looked at through that lens before. So that's an example, I guess, of the reframing that really has big societal impact.
There's so much going on here. Can we have you? I need to have you both back together. There's just so many. We've got so many episodes here to explore. Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I've got loads of questions, so I'm going to hold some back. But yeah, truly fascinating stuff.
So our other delight of a guest, Barbara, tell us, what are your intersections and how do you describe what you do?
Okay, I'm going to start with a conversation that Rodger and I have had in different ways on a couple of occasions. And we often end up with this circling around this question of how then should we live, or what might be the art of living? And those questions, those really deep, profound questions, are something that I think we both share. And if we sort of circle back, our pathways may have been different, but they've been underpinned by these. On one level, they're deeply human questions, and also they're about our kind of responsibilities to each other and also to the planet. So if I was to kind of step back and go, I often ask myself, like, how did I get here? Why am I like me? And I grew up in Africa. You know, my parents took me there. My dad worked in aid, and he worked in stuff that was broadly linked to sustainable living. And one of the things that used to happen, because we lived in these, you know, places like Swaziland, where there was lots of expatriates, and we'd have these conversations where people had come from all over the world with the best of intentions to make water more available, to help women, to reduce disease, all kinds of things. And more often than not, things weren't stitching up, I would say. The conversations were, why things are not working? What have we not done? Why isn't it working? And I was a kid. I just kind of had these questions floating in my mind without really kind of knowing that they had become my own questions. And then when we moved back to Australia, I kind of had a whole bunch of other questions that were linked again to understanding urban living and commercial life. And they were kind of like these worlds that just kind of seemed like almost like polar opposites in many ways. And when I was sort of confronted with what do I want to do and go to uni, I started to think, okay, well, what I'm really interested in is trying to understand humans. And I also want to understand what it means to live on the planet. And I want to kind of go deep diving into this. And I also have always loved making things. I think I was also really profoundly impacted by life in Africa, where I just thought people were so clever with how they use resources and how they made things. And there was just sort of a very tactile engagement with the world, and particularly through hands, being hands-on. You know, I remember, I don't know if you've ever seen them, the little kind of toys that are often made out of sliced up, aluminium beer cans and drink cans. And there's just so many instances of that. And as a kid, you just go, oh, wow, that's so cool. How did they come up with that? And hacks on systems all the time. They're kind of basic, but it makes so much sense. And it's really resourceful. So that was always kind of something that really fascinated me. But I also had a really profound interest in building, and I still do. So I went off and did architecture, and then kind of got I got two things. I was really inspired by the sort of ecosystems approach that was part of one strand of architecture. And I kind of got despondent with the kind of mass building, stuff that just didn't inspire me would be the short answer. And then I kind of really thought, okay, what I'm really interested in is actually understanding humans. So I went off and did a degree in psychology and anthropology, and with a bit of philosophy on the side. And when I finished that, I had this burning charge to kind of really understand what sustainability meant. That was sort of the kind of early concerns. Well, I wouldn't say early. There were concerns in the 90s. They're still here now, and they have actually been around for a lot longer than even the 90s, around how we would live sustainably. And I thought, okay, well, I need to understand what nature. And so I went and did a master's in environmental planning. And, going back to that original basketball bouncing, cities connection, those sorts of things are like, how do we live as humans, as a kind of species on the planet? How does that all work? How do we find that space of balance? And for me, one of the kind of powerful mediums for exploring that, but also communicating about it, was through the arts. And I loved film. I loved photography. I mean, I love drawing and printmaking, but I love those storytelling mediums because it felt like you were able to reach people in a kind of really human way with sort of the scenarios that maybe, I don't know, Excel sheets couldn't, and quite possibly academic papers. So I thought, okay, I need to learn how to become a storyteller. And, I started writing children's stories, and I started working in film, and kind of tried to teach myself through working, doing how to make films. And that was how I kind of came to meet all kinds of people, because we've got a great filmmaking community here in Australia. And then that filmmaking community ended up being part of my connection to go over to live in San Francisco. I didn't actually work on Mythbusters, but my other half did. So I was on Mythbusters sets all the time, and I was in their workshops. So I absorbed heaps by osmosis, and it was an amazing experience. It really was. And alongside of that, I've always been a teacher at university. And, I believe in education is a really powerful way of learning to be together, but also how we do that can shape how we think. So this is where the creativity comes in, is how can we kind of live, but how can we use all these different tools at our hand, including education, to respond to those challenges.
Now, I think we could end the podcast there almost. Like, we've covered so much ground in a short amount of time, and we're just at the intros. I'm saying this with all compliments as well. Rodger, now I know you're heavily involved in the arts. Rodger, were you involved in music? I'm sure I read this somewhere, but I then could not find the reference for it. You've got a degree in music, or you played a lot of music. What's your background there?
I have a family history in music. So my father was in the Easy Beats, which was one of Australia's biggest bands.
John, this is a very Easy Beats, very very well known Australian band,
sort of a
huge
Australian to AC/DC, a lot.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah. Have you held on to that love for heavy rock, Rodger?
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually have some of my father's instruments here with me, and it's definitely. I actually sat in on Barbara's course that she runs on the master's program that we both work on, which is Creative Catalyzer. And I approached it as course director, but also as, this is great and I want to do it. So I engaged with the material. And by the end of that 6-week subject, I'd started composing little pieces of music on my computer and slicing them into our recordings of the lecture material. And so it's definitely a creative output for me. I haven't performed music, and I'm not sure that I will, but maybe never say never. So I'm learning bass. I've always played guitar, and now I have a whole rack of guitars, including my father's bass, and he was the bass guitarist in the Easy Beats. So it's a kind of special,
I guess the question, and we talk a lot around on the show about the intersection of arts and science, technology, and what happens outside of the workplace, like the traditional workplace, how it sort of feeds into the workplace. How important do you think it's both been for you to have that as your counterbalance to some of the more academic work that you do? Or how does that play out, do you think?
Yeah, hugely important. And it is sort of the art that I lean into. So every night after teaching, I'll pick up the guitar and just strum away, or maybe I'll record the interlude to slice into the recording when I get it from Zoom the next day. It's been a go-to for me, especially over the last, I'd say, 3 years. Before then, it was listening to music and exploring different lineages of music, sort of going back through back catalogues. And interestingly, we were talking about framing before, so I'll just go back to the Easy Beats quickly. The Easy Beats met in a migrant hostel in Australia. Now, we don't have migrant hostels at the moment. We have detention centres. And I just wonder how many wonderful migrants have come to Australia and gone on to do amazing things like the Easy Beats. And I just wonder how the framing of that experience for people might impact. Will we get another Easy Beats coming out of a detention centre? I'm not so sure. It seems that that sort of framing leads to a traumatic experience rather than a new start, which was what the migrant hostel was. But for my father, music was a huge connector and a way of him connecting with different cultures. So he's Dutch by birth, and in the band were people there was a Dutchman, and people from England and Scotland, but they came together over music. And so it was a connector for him. It's a connector for me, I guess, back into my family heritage, having not grown up with him around, but having met him in adulthood and got to know him in adulthood. It is a connector, I guess, back into my own family heritage. And it's also just a way, I think, of unlocking a part of the brain. So I spoke about Barbara's subject before. I would have the microphone off while listening to her, and I would be strumming a ukulele, or maybe playing on my keyboard that's hooked up to my computer, just tinkering whilst listening and while engaging. And I guess in the workplace, I do little sketches. So
good to hear. Good to hear.
At one point, I had a policy of trying to encapsulate every meeting I ever went to in a little drawing. So I could flip back through my notepads and see an ice cream if it was a really sweet meeting, or a locked treasure chest if it was a meeting that just didn't get anywhere. That kind of visual language.
That's a lot of meetings, yeah.
I just have people sort of peering. What's he sketching? What does he think of my presentation? What's he drawn?
Now, Barbara, you're in a similar sort of creative space, and like sort of mind blown when I read through your CV and your resume, this crossover. How does that creation, let's say, drive the academia and the thinking, and what's the link there for you, if that's the right question?
Well, I'm going to start with a kind of slightly academic response, because in a way, I feel like a lot of what we do creatively, and particularly if we have a creative practice, we intuitively know what's happening, and we're kind of following an intuitive path, and which is sort of, on one way, kind of we have a sense of a direction, and another way, because we haven't got a roadmap, we're observing and figuring out what happens at the same time. But if you were to kind of, what I love about neuroscience is we're sort of able to kind of jump in the brain and kind of look at it, the mapping of energy, and how it moves in a way that people have maybe philosophized about and talked about what's happening in a creative process. And one of the things that does seem to happen is that, and I talk about creativity as a form of fitness, is that when you're doing, you might be drawing, you might be doodling, you might be playing with music, you might be playing with color, you might be playing with, what do you call it? Cookie dough. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. There's so many ways you can approach what is creativity, but you're playing with the world in some way, shape, or form. And that is at the same time changing the kind of information that's coming up through your body into your brain. And whatever's happening at the same time is there are new pathways or new possibilities. So I think one of the things that people often kind of look for in creativity is like, I did this, and so it should lead to this. But I don't think it works that way. I think you're kind of honing lots of possible connections, and you don't know necessarily how they're all going to combine. And because you might have been drawing or playing with color, and that is honing your attention to color in the world, and you might notice something, or it might create a pathway to a memory or a set of associations that doesn't seem to have anything to do with color at all, but you've been creating those possibilities in terms of how you might process information. And on the flip side of it, it's, when I listen to Rodger, and I know this story well, that he was responding in this way with his creative musical combinations, or compositions, I should really say, is that, we've all got different mediums that I think we're attracted to because for some reason, biophysically, it works for us. So I really think that a lot of creative practices help us to kind of recalibrate our nervous system. They help us to kind of calm and make those connections. So in the same sort of way that they talk about sort of mindful meditation, where, if you've got sort of a certain mind state, then certain kind of connections can happen. And I think for a lot of people, that's part of their creative practice, that intuitively they're responding to their body's call to do something a certain way so that they might make connections or see the world anew.
Well, I'm writing so many notes here.
Just stepping in on that, Barbara, and much in the way that Rodger has music as one of his go-to creative pursuits, is writing one of your creative pursuits? You mentioned about writing children's books. Do you still write as a means of putting something out there, or just losing yourself in something?
I think ultimately I love story. And I take a very, I guess you would call it, multimodal approach. In other words, whatever medium is involved in telling that story, I love embracing. And when I've got that story live, or it's sort of starting to breathe, it doesn't matter whether it's words, whether it's poems, whether it's making costumes, making sets, all of that just becomes for me easy and inviting, an invitation to discover something new or gain a new skill. So when I say, I wouldn't call myself a writer per se, but I find it easy to write things when I have a story to tell. And I find it easier to write things like children's stories and scripts and even lyrics than I do academic work. That is a kind of different kind of thinking. I think it's a synthesizing thinking, and that's a form of creativity in and of itself. But for me, it's the story and bringing that story alive.
Okay, now it's time for a thought experiment. Just explain the context. Our show is called The Occupational Philosophers, and philosophers throughout time have done thought experiments where they may gather, they may stretch their thinking, they reframe the way they look at the world, so they expand their thinking, go to that higher level of reasoning and understanding, ask those big questions. So John and I like to do thought experiments each and every week, which we do just that. So this one, because I thought both your long history in education, we would do a thought experiment around school reports. What we're going to do is we're going to give you someone's school report. So it's a true school report, and you have to guess which person it is. We'll give you two choices. So it's either an A or a B. Okay. And if you get it right, there'll be much salutations and clapping. If you get it wrong, we'll just move on to the next one. So first one, let's kick off. This person has glaring faults, and they have certainly glared at us this term. Was this for Oprah Winfrey, or was it for Stephen Fry, who's the actor and writer? We'll go to Rodger. Who do you think?
I have a bit of a family connection to Stephen Fry. Yeah, he. So my wife's uncle was the chap whose credit card was stolen that led to Stephen Fry going to prison way back when.
I've forgotten that story.
That is a hell of a connection.
I'm such a fan of Mr. Fry, and I think it was Stephen Fry's school report.
Correct. That was Stephen Fry's school report. Not the answer I expected, but story is good. All right, John, fire away. What's your next one?
So this one for you, Barbara, is a constant trouble to everybody and is always in some scrape or other. They cannot be trusted to behave themselves anywhere. Was that Winston Churchill or Michelle Obama?
I think it was Winston Churchill, because I've heard Michelle Obama talk about herself, and she describes herself as a very good student all the way through. And and a pleaser.
We've forgotten you watch TED Talk. So yeah. Yes, that is correct. That is correct. Right. Next
We
one.
might have been able to add, if I'd added Boris Johnson or Winston Churchill, you might have been struggling a bit there, wouldn't you?
That's the
But
one.
yeah, I'd be pushed a bit harder.
All right. Certainly on the road to failure, hopeless, rather a clown in class, wasting other people's time. Was this Jim Carrey or John Lennon? Rodger.
Oh, wow. This is a tough one. John Lennon was very cheeky, I understand. But I'll go for Jim Carrey.
Sorry to say, that was John Lennon. That was John Lennon. All right, John, over to you.
Okay. He will either go to prison or become a millionaire. Was that Richard Branson, the entrepreneur, or Al Capone? And that's to you, Barbara.
Yeah, I reckon it could be Richard. I've read his bio, and I know that he definitely struggled in the education system and had some brilliant ideas. I'm going to go with Richard. Yep.
That is correct. That's an exceptional answer there. Yes, absolutely.
Right,
well done.
Our next one. He will never amount to anything. Was that the Dalai Lama or Albert Einstein?
Oh, my goodness. Look, I'll go for Einstein.
Ding, ding. That is right. Well done. Well done, Rodger. Well done.
I was thinking we could have kicked off an international incident if Rodger had said the other one. Let's be fair. Barbara, a persistent muddler, vocabulary negligible, sentences malconstructed. He reminds me of a camel. Was that Roald Dahl, the author, or Gene Simmons from Kiss?
Oh, that's tricky, that one.
It's the camel that's throwing
bio.
you, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I read Roald Dahl's bio. I haven't read Gene Simmons.
It's a good one. Should have seen what they were doing. Yeah.
Just trying to think. Look, I'm going to go with Gene just to keep it kind of. I don't remember Roald having issues with mumbling, but he could have. It's just not resonating with my associations with Roald.
It was a persistent muddler, not mumbler.
Muddler.
Did you hear muddler?
Yeah, muddler. Ooh.
I don't know if that changes it.
We will need to take an answer, or you'll have to buy this. Pass on this.
Look, I'll go with Gene, but I don't know enough about Gene, but it's not what I associate with Roald. So there you go.
Unfortunately, it is Roald Dahl.
Really?
Roald Dahl, yeah. Should we do one more, Simon?
Yeah, I think I will. All right. Which one?
That's one.
All right. Would be a very good pupil if she lived in this world. Is that Dame Judi Dench or Liz Truss, the new UK Prime Minister?
Oh, now you're being cruel.
Thought experiment. We didn't say it'd be easy.
I don't know enough about the new Prime Minister. She wasn't really on the scene when I lived in England. So, and Dame Judi Dench, what an amazing person. And I guess as an actor, being able to dissociate is an important skill. So I'll go for Dame Judi Dench.
Your forensic background has come in very strongly here, the way you go through this. It's Dame Judi Dench. So well done. And that was the thought experiment school reports. Da-da-da-da. Now, we absolutely loved working through your book, Creative Reboot, and very exciting to be sitting here with newly minted authors. Now, look, where did the inspiration come from for the book and the title? And I guess the following one is, why reboot as opposed to something else?
So just the title, I guess, is just to a large extent, what we're trying to do is reach people who, for whatever reason, feel like they've lost their creative mojo, or they might be working in environments that they feel that you can't be creative in, particularly people who are kind of working really analytical roles, or whose workplace is very sort of procedural, and or people who have ended up in that space and maybe feel that somewhere along the line there's been a kind of progressive loss of their creative pulse. So the reboot thing is, how do you kind of bring it back up? How do you revitalize it? And it's very much based on the premise that we are all born with it. You know, you look at children and they're just endlessly creative, endlessly curious, endlessly playful and experimental. And somehow we seem to kind of lose that spark at times, depending on our particular practices. So that's where the name of the book came from. What was the other parts of the question?
Or I guess the early part was, where did the inspiration from the book come from? I guess that sort of might be one of the same. So,
well, it's a little bit that, but also I think the inspiration is also that I think we've come to kind of look at creativity in this kind of weird way, as if you're sort of born with it. Maybe you might be a genius, and we often associate it with either people who are kind of working in the innovation space, or you're an artist.
Yeah.
And we've kind of lost this conversation around creativity in its many different forms, and how it might be kind of recognized in many, many different kinds of disciplinary practices. So the book in and of itself is the bringing together of many different disciplines and practices, just little bits and little nods, little tools that are used all over the place and that should be recognizable. You know, maybe you might work as an ecologist, or maybe you work as an artist, or maybe you work in theatre, or maybe you're a voice practitioner. So, or maybe you work as a geographer. So there should be little echoes all over the place that kind of go, hey, everybody's invited here.
And Barbara touched on it before as well when she used the words, how then shall we live? I think in the work that I've done over the last 20 years across a bunch of sectors, I've come across a lot of workplaces that are really stuck in analysis paralysis. You know, they try to analyse their way out of a complex issue. And as a world, we're drifting into a future that's not of our choosing, and that's not good enough. We need to take responsibility for the world that we are shaping. And creativity is a really necessary ingredient for that. If we can't step out of our current frames, and if we prioritize efficiency over creativity, then we're just going to get to that endpoint faster, and you know, things aren't really heading in the direction that we want. So I think part of the overall work that Barbara and I do with our colleagues is about working with organisations to unlock that analysis paralysis, to bring in different ways of coming up with better outcomes for the world. And you know, the people that Barbara and I work with on the master's program are leaders in organisations who can affect change. And the program that we work on has creativity stitched through it and reframing stitched through it. And so I guess if we talk about the inspiration and the ambition of the body of work that Barbara and I are working on, it really is that, you know, that global vision of, you know, we need better ways of working. We need different tools. We need to not drift into a future that's not of our choosing, but to deliberately shape a better world.
Picking up on some of the language early on in the book, there's a talk about creative intelligence. And I think, Barbara, maybe that comes a little bit to what you were just saying, is a recognition maybe first and foremost that we all have different creative, there's almost intelligences. It's almost like Gardner's multiple intelligences, that within the creative spectrum, we can all have these different things. So there's a recognition that we need to be able to draw that out. And then you also talk about creative fitness, which suggests then that having recognized that, we can apply ourselves and practice and exercise to do that. Is that kind of almost something of what the book is seeking to encourage, for people to recognize they are creative, and then recognize then there's a way of exercising, a way of working to then develop that? Would that be, who wants to talk to that maybe?
I'll jump in, and then Rodger may want to kind of bounce off it. But yeah, absolutely, that's it. And it's the idea that you can, there is many ways, and I hate putting things in boxes, but it does draw on Gardner's ideas in that it diversifies what we think of even as being an intelligence. You know, that people can be kinesthetically intelligent, people can be olfactorially intelligent. You get jobs being a sommelier and, you know, a wine taster. There's all kinds. Yeah. And some people can be kind of savants almost at one thing and is very exclusive. And then you'll find that there are other people who are very kind of evenly distributed across a range of different ways of knowing. And I really want to kind of create a space for all of that. to be given space to breathe and to be recognized. I don't think our education system does a great job of giving space for that. But the other thing is that the more you practice it, the more you kind of, I don't think it's anything more than the same sort of principles we would apply to exercise, called catching a ball. If you practice catching a ball, there'll be one day a day when you catch a ball, you'll be able to catch 3 balls. You'll be able to do things that maybe link to catching balls, but are not catching balls. And you'll be able to do it without even thinking because it's become part of you. So obviously, if you practice a form of attention, this is what I think creativity is. It's a kind of a form of attention or attentiveness to the world. So when you started off with like all the curiosity stuff, that's it. It's like they're sort of just noticing lots of different things across lots of different levels. And that's what the book aims to just kind of stimulate. And it can be something that might be linked to people who really haven't done that for a really long time. And there's a sort of structured journey in the book to kind of support that. But you could also be someone who's really adept at it. You might be someone who works in a creative profession, but you might have let something go to sleep, or you might just want to kind of short circuit an idea. You might have got into a kind of a circular way of thinking. So how do you bust out of that? So that's where all the tools come in, because they should be usable quick and fast for people who are used to it, but also there to kind of help promote that fitness and diversity.
Now, speaking on tools and structure of your book, it sort of leads into our next question. I guess, firstly, when I read through the book, it's so visual, like my heart, my soul lit up really. And I'm from this space, so as Rodger knows, some of the stuff we've done together. So like I'm like, oh my, this is so easy to engage with. So I guess number one question is, it's very visual, but it's very action and making and doing orientated, but it also has a particular flow. So I'm interested in, I'm not sure which one to address first, which one came first, the flow of the book or the approach, or I'd like to know a little bit more about those. And there's 6 key areas as well. And John, do you just want to read those out just so we get some context, and then we can maybe talk to them?
Yeah. So you have creativity, play, and flow, which I know you kind of cite as being the foundational qualities. And I think that's really interesting. And then you come into then practices around probing, blitzing, visualizing, scaling. And then there seems then a distinction drawn out to the last 2, which is conversations and stories. So yeah, that's quite a chunky one to take a bite out of, but who'd like to start on that? Maybe those foundational qualities first: creativity, flow, and play, because that's really interesting. And we've touched on those topics before when we've had some conversations before, haven't we, Simon? But
absolutely, yeah.
Rodger, do you want to go to that one first? Maybe the foundational qualities.
Yeah, well, Barbara's name is first on the book for a very good reason, in that while I worked with her and earned my name on the front cover of the book, it really is conceptually a lot of her thinking. And
okay, all right, stop there, Rodger. Barbara, can you tell us about creativity?
Thanks, mate, but really, over to Barbara. Yeah.
No, I'm joking. Rodger, please.
Keep going.
Genuinely, I'm joking. This is a not so serious business podcast.
No. I was about to throw to Barbara.
Okay, so we'll do table tennis here, and I'll bounce back to you in a minute, Rodger.
Okay, I like this.
But yeah, look, I feel like you've got to start with a playful space. It's got to be a safe space. Play is where we experiment. And I think one of the people I quote in the book is a psychiatrist, Stuart Brown. He works with people who have maybe been at the top of their game, done things that were once their kind of core driving motivation, and they've lost their drive. He's also worked with people who are really depressed, and he's also worked with people big organizations who want to innovate. And he starts off with the premise that play is absolutely essential. And in the way that kind of smoking needed a whole reframe, because, smoking was cool, it was glamorous, it was all these things, and it needed a reframe to acknowledge all the things that it is associated with. And he says that we actually need culturally, globally, a reframe of play, because people often think the opposite of play is work. And he said, no, it's actually depression. So play is an intrinsic, evolutionary, adaptive quality that's linked to curiosity and recalibration and finding the boundaries and finding the edges. And it's kind of got an openness that's linked to playing games, but it's less structured, and you can riff and you can adapt. So the things that Rodger talks about in terms of playing an instrument, I might do this, I might do that, and dancers might do it. Whatever it is, whatever your play space is, it's so important if we're going to kind of get out of the thinking and the fog that we are in. You know, we can't kind of solve the problems of the world with the same kind of thinking, and play is that starting place. And then the other bit is that flow. That's the kind of Mahali Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, which is when you're doing something that you're deeply engrossed in, that is kind of got the right level of challenge for you, so you're not bored and you're not so challenged that you feel intimidated or out of depth, you will become so absorbed in the moment that you'll lose your sense of time. And there's a kind of complete immersion in it. And the more you can kind of become aware of what that quality is, that you might be doing that for 5 minutes, but that 5 minutes is full absorption, or it could be longer. That is really useful use of yourself and time and your attention. And also it can be a pointer to, that's what I really thrive on. That's where I can really kind of sink in and kind of absorb life and respond to it. So those are the kind of foundations of like getting that going, and giving people, you know, who say, if you're used to working in a procedural scheduled world and you're trying to open people up to play, or people who take themselves really seriously because they are the experts, you kind of have to wear a demeanor that life is serious. And that's actually not the case. And especially if we want to kind of move and work together in an experimental way, we do need to find that place. And it doesn't mean we're larking around and being stupid. We can be doing that. But it's actually giving space for this kind of quality of working together. So I think that's so important. And that's the beginning of the book. And then do you want to just talk a little bit about abduction, Rodger? Because it's kind of connected to that space of sort of searching and playing with the unknown.
On this, John and I were talking about it first, and we couldn't. John, what were you wondering? Innovative abduction. What were you thinking?
I thought it was about kidnapping an inventor. Sounded like some form of industrial espionage.
Or aliens taking our best ideas back to their planet and then using them against us.
Definitely explain more, Rodger, that innovative abduction piece.
If we framed it correctly, yes.
Yeah. And it's part of it, really. So the phrase was coined by a philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, who is one of the American pragmatists in the late 1890s. And that body of work went on to influence design research and design. And so I've picked it up from my colleague, Professor Case Dorst, who I work with now, and Barbara, and have worked with since 2010. So he's really the guru of frame innovation. His research was a part of his research was interviewing creatives from around the world, architects, designers, planners, etc., to get an understanding of how they take on complex issues. And one of the highlights of that body of work is this notion of reframing. And the research centre that I worked at with him was all about creating methods to support the act of reframing. So design abduction is part of different ways of thinking. So people are used to the term deduction, which is about really reasoning from cause to effect. So we know what happened, we know how it happened, how it would happen, so then we can deduce the effect that is going to occur. Induction is slightly different in that we know the what variable and we know the outcome variable, but we're not sure how. And so then we use induction to come up with a hypothesis that can then be tested. So science draws on that on that particular logic quite heavily. Then there's normal abduction, where it's solid problem solving based on experience. So we know the outcome we want to achieve. We have our discipline area, and then we use our experience to generate a what, to generate a new thing. Design abduction or innovative abduction is a different beast in that the what and the how variables bracketed. So we suspend judgment on what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. We only focus on the outcome. And so when I mentioned the knife crime example earlier on, the outcome was still the same. They wanted to reduce knife crime. But instead of the how being policing, the how became public health. And that opened up an enormous array of new whats that they could do. So that's innovative abduction, where you put aside your preconceptions about what and how you're going to work towards an outcome. And I think it's a build on what Barbara was saying before in the development of that body of work to methodologies to support reframing. Play and flow was so important, creating that playful space. I used music quite a lot. A lot of that work was done in multi-stakeholder workshops or with community groups, and lightening some Fleetwood Mac to talk to a group of people about domestic violence was just so important. And then we would, we'd use Post-it notes, we'd use, we'd build little models out of paddle pop sticks, etc., but all around a methodology. So not play for play's sake, play to open people's lenses and open them up to a different way of thinking, but then move into the creative space of what if things were different, and how could we approach this challenge differently, and what would that look like? And that's where probing and blitzing really comes into it. It's where visualizing comes into it as well. So I think what we've done in the book and the flow of it really goes, while it's not necessarily a linear process, the first step in all of my practice when I'm dealing with a really complex issue and multiple stakeholders is to find that play space and to acknowledge that we're all here dealing with really heavy content, and therefore let's do it with a smile on our face and in a way that is playful, because through that play we might just come up with a different way of approaching this issue.
Yeah, I love it. So just that opening, like what you've spoken about, and often we think there's like, if you do this, then that will happen. All right, give me a model. I want to do this, go to the workshop, go bang. But I've talked about that so much as well. It's not like that. it's that you throw so much stuff into it, and eventually some stuff will come out if you create those right environments, but you're never quite sure what the path is.
The high level of this then, and again catching in some of the within the book, there is a divergent phase though, and then a convergent phase. And are those 6 steps, is that what you're trying, are they the steps that would take you through that divergent through to convergent kind of outcome, as it were?
Yeah, that's definitely the kind of idea. I mean, I think there's different pulses to the double diamond process of divergence and convergence, but the play space is the place that opens up for divergence. And similarly, each step is a process of kind of catching some of those ideas. First, so probing and blitzing is still about widening it out, looking for the possibilities. And it's also about tuning that sensibility to kind of picking up ideas, noticing things that are serendipitous, things that might be left of field. And what I would call honing that intuitive response is like, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole for a second because it feels like it's related. I don't know why. And again, I find the people who are accomplished creative practitioners really are comfortable with kind of working in that kind of playful, expansive space, and that instinct to follow an idea. And it doesn't mean that idea is going to be something, but you're going to discover something along that way that will give you another kind of association. And then visualizing is a process of catching those ideas, finding their form, finding their color, finding their symbolic patterns of association. Visualizing is a way of kind of starting to chunk things and kind of bring it into view. And then I think of scaling as this beautiful space between thinking about the macro and the micro and how they intersect. And kind of there's so many thought experiments you can play in that space. So you're playing thought experiments. It's that midpoint of kind of trying to land it, but also seeing what the possibilities are. And then the next phase is sort of taking it out again and playing with the social and the conversational context, so that you can kind of end up in this space where you tell a story. And that story is really nuanced, and it's a new story, and it would never have been the story that you thought you were going to start off with. Well, it might be, but it's generally not, and it shouldn't be. There definitely should be new stuff in there.
I like this. And so it's a way to take you, like we often will we go to problem solving, we'll go think, okay, I can see the solution already. But this just provides so many, layers and openness and diverging and converging, all these different things to help you be open to that new story that's there as well, and finding the story in this piece. So,
and open, I guess, to that innovative abduction. So not every issue needs to have that kind of paradigm shift. It might be that you can come up with a viable proposition that shifts the situation enough to be useful just through a little bit of design thinking. Like that's great if that can happen. But I think if you're only using an approach like that, then you're probably only going to end up with an intervention that's within the current frame. So it's really about opening up the potentiality to completely reframe. And an example of that, there's examples in the book written by people who've done Barbara's course and are doing the master's program. But a particular example of something I worked on that had that big paradigm shift was alcohol-related violence. And I came at this from a couple of angles. So as a public servant, I was applying that rigorous evidence-based crime prevention approach to a little area in Sydney called King's Cross. And King's Cross back then was a real hub of nighttime entertainment and adult entertainment and live music, etc. And it was also Australia's hotspot of assault late at night. And so from a policing perspective, we knew what to do and we were doing it. The problem was it wasn't having any impact at all. Not really. And so the Designing Out Crime Centre that I later worked at applied this innovative abduction approach and reframed the issue through playful engagement, going out and immersing themselves in the nighttime and getting a sense of what was really going on, talking to people, trying to understand why they were there, and coming to a useful conclusion that people were there as part of a rite of passage, a part of growing up. In Sydney at that time, it was a cultural experience to go to King's Cross, and the vast majority of people would probably only go there once or twice, and then that rite of passage was fulfilled. But the crime prevention approach that we had taken from the public service treated everyone basically as if they were a criminal, and it wasn't helping. So if the outcome that we want is a safer nighttime, we've got to think and reframe from a knowledge of the values that people have that they want to experience when they go there. So if it's about rite of passage, where else do we see rite of passage? Where else do we see identity forming experiences? And one of the reframes that came out of that process was, well, actually music festivals are pretty good at creating a rite of passage experience that is part of identity forming as a young adult. And they have an evidence base behind them, which is called event management. So what if we, instead of trying to use target hardening and policing, what if we looked at King's Cross as if it was an event and used the principles of event management? Now, fast forward 12 years now, a lot has happened in that space. There's now the Global Cities After Dark movement across the world. There's 42 mayors of the night. Nightmares is a terrible word.
I like it though. Yeah.
42 cities that have taken on this notion of this is a late night economic development opportunity. And if we use event management principles, we can make it safer, but without losing the vibrancy. So that work was part of a global movement, which would never have happened if I'd stayed in my role as a crime prevention officer using policing. But coming over to Designing Out Crime, I was able to jump on that frame and help make it see the light of day and help organisations come to terms with it and visualise it through other student activities that we did, and go to meetings with the Lord Mayor, go to meetings with this minister, that minister, etc., to just storytell, which comes into the book later, around, well, what if we treated this issue as if it was something like this? And so to your point, Simon, yes, the thinking can happen just in a brief workshop, but if the impact we're looking for is big, then it takes years and years and years, and it takes engaging a lot of people in that narrative and embodying that narrative through their work. And so I think what we're broadly trying to do, and this book is a big part of that, is to create that community of practice that can then take on these big issues in a different way to get to a different outcome and a better outcome.
I was just thinking maybe come back to you, Barbara, as well, from Rodger's comments there and what you were describing, the process. Is one of the biggest challenge just time and patience to work through such a process as is described, and what Rodger's just caught there with something which was a long process of engagement, of deep thought? Is it just maybe thinking about when you might bring it into an organization? Are they just going to go, we don't have time to be able to get into it in this way? Is that the challenge, or as well as the mindset piece?
Well, yes and no, in a way, because I think that it, as I said, it's a kind of it's a way of attending that can be experienced and found in any moment. You can be on the way to the loo, you can be going to the train, you can be in a shopping center. It can happen anywhere, and it's just actually a practice of attention. And that's one of the invitations in the book. There are these things that the cards are these shorthand ways. It's just like, just do this, like have a speed date with a color. Just go, I'm going to pick that blue today. I'm going to look around the room. I'm going to pick that blue. And today I'm just going to notice that blue. And what you're doing is you're attuning your sensibility. You might forget, and you might like come in and out, and it might be like 2 minutes at different periods of the day. But what you're doing is you're creating those pathways. You're practicing that pattern of attention. So anyone who tells me I don't have time, I say you do have time. You've got every waking moment of your day to just give it a little bit of a nod. And the more you do it, the more you'll just be endlessly curious. And there'll be these kind of two things. Our brains are so complex. Our beings are so complex. We can notice and process multiple things at any one moment in time. So if we kind of just ask for our radar to be a little bit more acutely tuned here and there and build that in, we can do all kinds of stuff. So that's the first part of it. And that changes how we are and what we see. And then if we do that collectively and together, then what we bring into a room starts to shift and change. But then there is that other stuff, which I would call the slow burn stuff and the ecosystem stuff, because we do live in a culture, and we live in a culture where we have practiced how to pay particular kinds of attention. And we notice certain things, we use ourselves in certain kinds of ways, which almost like, we will use time in a particular way, and it's still a practice. So we need to kind of bust out of that, and then when we change how we are collectively in a moment, in a room, in an innovation strategy, that too will slowly lead to things. But I think we need support from each other, and that's that community of practice stuff. We need to collectively create space, and for those big, complex, networked challenges, they do take time, and they do take a distributed kind of network that will hold space for those things. And then you'll slowly see these kind of shifts in the system and the forms of kind of patterns that are attracting each other and holding things in form, or the releasing of patterns. So it's yes, and there's and more.
So yes and response there.
This is too good.
Like, holy shit, like serious.
You're the perfect guests for occupational philosophers. I mean, the very fact that you said, how should we live life? Well, that was the ultimate philosophical question as posed by Socrates as he walked around Athens. So yes, this is it. You're in the right space. This is the Venn diagram that we wish to play in. Time for another thought experiment, Barbara and Rodger. And as we prepared for today's episode, we went to find out about some more books that you've been writing, because obviously Creative Reboot is one of the books you have. But as I did a search on Watson and Doran, I found that you've also written Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, Volume 13. I don't know if you know that. Do you remember writing that?
I do not remember.
I'm quite serious. It has Watson and Doran as two of the accredited authors. So I thought, wow.
So much content coming out, they can't even remember back. Like,
so we'll put it in the show notes so people could see. So I thought, wow, you two are pretty impressive. I mean, finding time to write Sherlock Holmes as well as fantastic books about creativity. So this experiment is called Elementary, my dear Watson. And the question tone at the end is necessary there with the question mark, the rising tone. We're going to give you 6 Sherlock Holmes titles, and you have to answer which you think are true. Could have been written by you, obviously. And if you think they're true, you have to say, elementary, my dear Watson. And if you think they're false, you have to say, the game's afoot, Moriarty. All right, so there we go. I will come to Barbara, I'll come to you first, and then Simon can come to Rodger next.
Well,
so
why don't you go to Rodger, because I had him last time. I sort of with the Dalai
Okay,
Lama.
all right.
So I think that'd be
Okay. So, Roger, let's give you a little, maybe an easy start here. The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Excellent.
that's
Well said,
correct.
sir.
Okay. Barbara, this is for you. The Case of the Hairless Cat.
Ooh. Elementary.
You should have been saying the game's afoot, Moriarty.
Oh, the game's of
That is
Moriarty.
false. Yes, that is
Okay.
false.
Yeah. Ooh.
And if you only just say elementary and you do get it right, it's only half a point. You need to say the whole thing.
Oh,
Elementary, my dear Watson.
elementary, my dear Watson.
Which was wrong.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
the game's afoot, Moriarty. So
The game is afoot, Moriarty.
now we've got the things
Yeah.
down there. Okay, John.
So, Roger, a whiff of scandal.
Oh, okay. I think I think I either know the book or chapter that this is from, or I know a book or chapter that has a plot line that would line up with this. So I am going to go Elementary, my dear Watson.
I'm terribly sorry, Roger. It's the game's afoot, Moriarty.
Oh, no.
I did a mix up there, a few things, but
Yeah.
that's what makes this such a challenging thought experiment.
Well, we don't want to give you easy
Familiar
thought
enough.
experiment. Socrates wanted to be challenged. So our next one.
Stretching the minds.
The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle.
Barbara's taking this very seriously. I
Yeah,
think
look, I'm
she
just
wants to
thinking
try and
about-
beat Michelle Obama's score, doesn't she?
I'm thinking about the words and the associations and the blue carbuncle. I don't know. I don't feel this is like a modern sort of title. So I'm inclined to think that it might have been something that infatuated people in previous times. So I'm going to say elementary, my dear Watson.
That is correct. Well done. You're on the scoreboard.
Yes.
Well done.
Yes.
You're now ahead of Boris Johnson when he was on. So well done. Well done.
Two more to go. Roger, back to you. The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist.
Yeah, like it could be another mashup, but it definitely feels like a Holmes story. So I'm going to say Elementary, my dear Watson.
That is correct. You're getting into the groove now, aren't you? And we've only got one more, unfortunately.
Our last one. This is Dr. Watson's Mysterious Wooden Cabinet of Oddities.
Well, obviously you'd want to say that it belongs to Dr. Watson. But then maybe somebody else wrote about it and it's a trick. Or it might be one of those new takes. I'm going to say it's a new take. So I'm going to say the game's afoot, Moriarty.
That is correct. Well done. Well done. And that brings us to the end of Elementary, my dear Watson.
I have to say, I've never seen anyone give it so much thought as you, Barbara. That was quite impressive. There was genuine sort of, okay, let's work through this. It was, I think you were probing, blitzing, visualizing.
Storytelling.
No, this is not a story. This is a story. It's fantastic.
You know, the cabinet of oddities makes me think. It does. It stimulates my visual imagination. I had this friend who made this most amazing cabinet of curiosities, and it was in part inspired by all the sets that were on different versions of Sherlock Holmes, because it was such a sort of, it was of that era. But she used kind of technology and phones, and it was just amazing. I've never seen anything quite like it since. But anyway, so I was visualizing.
Excellent.
Right.
I could see it.
Now we've just come to a rapid fire round. First one. We have built the Occupational Philosophers Manifesto, but every time we have a guest, we're also building the Occupational Philosophers Manifesto, if you see what we did there. Now, what one thing of all your learning do you think should be included? Barbara, I'll go to you first.
Of all my learning in life?
Yes, one short little piece.
Draw. Use your hands. And even if you haven't got your hands, you've still usually got connections that are connected to your hands. So do whatever is associated with your hands because they make memories and they connect our brains.
Rodger?
It's got to be framing. Be aware of the frame that's being presented to you and build a capability to reframe.
Now I'm just visualizing we've got a tree of our Madagesto tree. There's not a lot of space on that, so I might just get the first few bits, but I'm just letting you know.
Reframe.
Yeah.
And is there a book we should be reading? You could obviously say your own, but is there any other books that you think would be good for us to dip into? Maybe Rodger, come to you first this time.
Yeah, so we do mention in the book that this builds on a body of work that Barbara and I have both been contributing to. So Case Dorse's Frame Innovation, Create New Thinking by Design, and a previous book that I'm also co-author of, Designing for the Common Good, which is a book of case studies, methods and reflections on practice.
And Barbara, book recommendation?
Oh, look, I have so many different books, and I would have said the same. From the root system that we built on is very much built on frame innovation. Actually, Case also has some other wonderful books on notes on creativity. So there's lots of sort of little how-to things. And I think that that's the sentiment that we're kind of playing into. It's like we've got lots of books that describe the theory of and maybe even provide us with stories, but we are a bit short on those kind of tool books that give us lots of quick, short ideas and how-to approaches and kind of give us at the same time a little bit of meat behind it as to where it comes from and why. So I actually even like to talk about cookbooks. There's some great cookbooks out there. And one of my favorite ones, and it's something that I actually use as a kind of parallel because I feel like we need more of these in the whole creative space, is Stephanie Alexander's, I call it the Rainbow Cookbook, but I think it's called the Cookbook's Companion. And it's, it goes from A to Z of food, and it's got pairing items and what little short tips of what you can do, and also recipes that are collected from different people. And it kind of gives you this structured way of doing things, but also this how to riff and how to create combos. And I think, if we had that for music and we had it for painting and drawing and, all kinds of walks of life, so that's my dream, is like to keep making lots of tool books that just kind of expands.
Cool. And look, on that note, like we didn't get time to dive into it. This book, your book, is so practical and it's so you have to, it is unlike any other innovation book I've sort of spent time looking at, and it's so much fun to play in. Now, speaking of our next little piece is, imagine it's the later years of your life. You've wrapped up your careers in the world of innovation and creativity. You've taken into your retirement home and they introduce you and they say, firstly, here's Rodger. How would you like to be introduced?
He's really old. Still plays cricket.
And what was that, sorry?
And still plays cricket.
All right, I love it. Barbara?
Yeah, she's also really old. She's still pretty good at moving, but she's a lizard and she lives by the sea and she rolls into the sea regularly because she swam all her life and still does. But I'd also like to feel like I've inspired people to ask those deeper questions and to surprise themselves with what they can do on the planet.
That's a hell of an introduction, Barbara. I think the residents will have fallen asleep by then.
Yeah.
What did you say again? What's her name? Barbara.
I got Rodger. He likes cricket, but you went on a bit. So no.
Right. What are you up to next? What exciting projects are on the horizon for you? Barbara, I'll come to you first this time. What's happening next?
I want to make a TV show.
Ooh.
Which does this and kind of shows it in action. So where we are reframing, where we're working with like something that's quite complex social problems, complex problems that we all need to be involved in, bringing together different disciplines, different thinkers, people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in the mix, and seeing what we come up with. Yeah, so that's what I'd like to do.
Just as you've said that, I just thought that sounds absolutely awesome. I can absolutely see that on telly, just where you would have people come at complex problems and bring in all these disciplines and see what emerges and start to show that. That's a brilliant idea. Absolutely.
Sounds like when John was on the block in the UK. So, he was on the sides of buses and everything. Like,
oh, really?
Hey, here are my yellow overalls. John was a little
Excellent.
famous for a little while.
Yeah, for a little while.
Did you solve a complex problem on the block?
Well, this is my point.
How to hold down a job and do up a house. Yeah, it was pretty complex.
Yeah, that is. Yes.
So, Rodger, what are you up to next? What's on the horizon?
So Barbara and I are doing a lot of work at the university that we work at, the University of Technology, Sydney, bringing together people from across the university from multiple disciplines, looking at health through a few different lenses. So that's our current collaboration, and also bringing in partners from industry to collaboratively engage with some of the big health challenges that our society is facing. So that's the big focus at the moment, as well as working on the Master of Creative Intelligence and Strategic Innovation at TD School at UTS. And I should say that Barbara runs a subject in that master's program that is available without enrolling in the master's, and it's available online to anyone, anywhere in the world. It's called Creative Catalyzer.
And we will put notes to all of this stuff in the show notes as well. Now,
absolutely.
Before we send you on your way, where can we find the book? Like, where do we go to get your book? And I cannot recommend this enough. And it's literally, anyway, as you can tell, I'm a bit excited by it. But where can we find your book? And then following up, where can we find you and connect with you outside of our podcast?
So the book is probably most easily found online. So in Australia, if you look up Creative Reboot and you look up our surnames, you will find Booktopia probably has the best stockist. It's in Glebe Books. It will be in the MCA, and you can request it at other bookshops too. And then it is available in Europe and in the UK. And I believe, again, it's best if you just Google it. So I know it's at Book Depository.
Yeah.
But basically, I've looked at heaps of online booksellers, and it's everywhere. So you will find it that way.
Okay.
It's also in bookshops internationally. The previous one I worked on, Designing for the Common Good, was in heaps of bookshops in London. I had such a kick to walk into a bookshop and not expecting to see a book with my name on it in a bookshop.
Definite buzz.
I can't believe you got into the MCA, because I often, I'm sure I've chatted with John about it before, are not the best books in the whole world in art museum bookshops. Like all my books about innovation and creativity almost come from there. That's where I get all my inspiration from. So kudos to you to landing in there, because that's no small feat. And look, where can we connect with both of you, Liza? LinkedIn, websites. What's happening in your world socially where we can say hello? Rodger, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, we're both on LinkedIn. There's also a QR code on the back of the book that takes you through to a website, ci6.org, and that'll be a place where we invite people to contribute case studies and contribute their creative methods moving forward. So there's a QR code on the back of it, but it's ci6.org, and I'm on LinkedIn.
We also both work at UTS in the Transdisciplinary School. So if you just Google our names, it will take you to our staff profiles, and our email addresses are there too. So you can find us that way. We're just trying to build a community of practice, and it goes all the way from the book to the short courses to the community that we're building with the Masters of Creative Intelligence and Strategic Innovation. And that goes all the way out to all the research projects that we do as well.
Fantastic. And I was just going to say, is there any opportunity that you're going to be coming to the UK anytime soon?
Actually,
I would love to.
So would I. I just go, please come and say hello. If you ever do find yourself this way, please come and say hello. I'd love to catch up and buy you a drink. Rodger, but you were saying, have you got something on the horizon?
No, I was just saying I've got a visiting research fellowship at the Central St Martin's College, University of the Arts London. And before COVID, I was over there at least once a year catching up with the team over there. So hoping to get back there soon, and I will definitely remind you that you offered to buy me a beer.
Right. So I like this. Got to book Nymphs and a Central St. Martin's. These are all my highlight reels where I want to be. So this is fantastic. Yeah. Well done. So look, thank you so much for giving up your time, your energy, and all. Man, it's literally 10 episodes here. So maybe in the future we'd love to get you back on and talk a little bit more about this stuff. And yeah, look, all the best with the book launch. And there's so many exciting things coming on. And yeah, again, thanks so much for joining us on the Occupational Philosophers.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks to you both.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been a pleasure.
John, I know we say this every time, but holy crap, Batman. Oh,
Holy crap. Holy crap indeed. I felt like as they were coming at us with all those fantastic ideas and insights, it was like kapow, kaboom, bosh. I mean, just one after the other, massively profound thoughts and ideas. Just absolutely brilliant. I could have sat there all day, really just shooting the breeze and riffing on ideas. It was brilliant.
No, and there's so deep, the depth and breadth of knowledge across so many areas. What a pleasure to have those two people on the show.
Yeah, and they've synthesized it. And of course, that is the beauty of it all, isn't it? In all of this creative space, as you go out and have all those different disciplines that you dip into and have intersections with: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, art, architecture. And then you're able to synthesize that into then something that you can present to people and say, look, here's a way of thinking. Here's how to break out of patterns of thoughts and actually do things differently. That's the genius, or part of the genius anyway.
No, yeah, and then they've brought it into a way which is easy to engage with, especially in their book, which I keep recommending. How do you bring all this into a way that you can play with as well? Because their book has a bunch of activities as well. So, John, speaking of synthesizing, let's look at this through some of our takeaways through the lens of, individual, team, and sort of a leader or organizational wide. What's something, you took away from that? You're sitting at home. What's the individual lesson just for yourself?
The individual lesson is the idea that there are multiple creative intelligences, just as the way there are multiple intelligences. People can be kinesthetically intelligent or academically intelligent, intellectually, interpersonally, and the same for creativity. So it would be to say, recognize we all have a creative intelligence, and straight away just put that to one side, that you are not creative. That's not true. You've just got to tap into maybe what your creative intelligence core is. There'll be something there in the way you express things creatively. So find it.
Yeah, and I like the one where she said, any creativity is attention. Anyone can practice paying attention. And as we know, put your phone down and look. Like, it is not hard. And I love that thought of hers around just look for things which are blue today. Like, what a great little game to have every day. And imagine what you'll notice.
Although, as she was saying that, I did think it must take her absolutely ages to go to the shops and back.
Yeah.
She'd be stopping every 30 seconds going, look at that. Isn't that interesting?
Get stuck in the
look at that blue thing over there.
Yeah, I've got yellow.
So teams, what do you think about teams? What did you get from some of the thoughts there that might distill into useful advice for teams?
Well, there's a couple there, but that piece around reframing, like, just are we asking the right question? Do we need to reframe this and look at this from another lens? And often it's driven by maybe the leader of that team. Okay, I know how to solve this, or this is my background. And we all do this. It's not like a necessarily a bad thing, but we're driven by, this is my experience. We'll frame it this way. Yeah. So reframing that all the problems, all teams are trying to solve problems.
And then for me, I think it came back to one of the foundational qualities was play. And Barbara talks about making sure there's a safe space for people to play. So reframe play as not being the opposite to work, but a means to open up curiosity and exploration. And in that, ensure that people can explore and play safely. We've talked about that before, but it's really important.
The opposite of depression, play is the opposite of depression. Like, what a reframe that is. And look, also doing that, you unlock analysis paralysis, so that we just go round and around and around and you get nowhere.
I don't know about you, Sam. I've never seen that in any team I've worked with.
No. Never at all. Never at all.
Yep. solving
Now,
problems.
and just thinking organizationally, or maybe with that leadership lens, but maybe anything from that, John?
For me, she talked to it a couple of times, building that community of practice. And I think what's great is the Creative Reboot book and the cards absolutely give you a practical way to do that, to build a community of practice whereby you get to get better creative fitness. And that was the other thing that stood out for me, that it's all about exercising, as it were, to get to a point where you are creatively fit, and it comes through practice.
Yeah, and I liked on the end of, and this pops up time and time again, like this theme is so consistent, the power of story. So the last piece of their process, number 6, and on a bunch of different things, tell a great story, engage people with story, find the story. And as she said, it does not live in a spreadsheet. Or maybe it does, but you need to get that story out. So, wow.
There we are.
Great show.
Let's do our wrap up then, Simon. So if you're listening, please leave a review, rate us, tell your friends, get other people to join the community of practice.
Tell your nan, your pop.
Tell your nan,
Granddad.
Especially your nan. Has she joined yet? No.
No. She's joining from another world, I would say, John, but that's another story. So, but thanks for bringing that up. God bless you, Nan. So.
All right, scrub that. Tell your friends. Check out the website, occupationalphilosophers.com. Get in touch, occupationalphilosophers@gmail.com.
And we've got a bunch of socials as well. You can ping us up. So John's all over them. And in the meantime,
stay curious, make stuff, play more, have fun, and
date life. Now, John, I've got one more little. What's the word we're looking for?
School report.
Yeah, school report. One more little school report. Now, this person looks like they could be blown over with a feather, both mentally and physically, with his long hair being the only thing he ever talks about. Is this The Rock or John Rice?
Piss off.